First story, The Unsettling Neighbors by Sarah Adams. It was supposed to be a relaxing escape from the city, a chance to unwind in the tranquility of nature. My friends and I had rented an Airbnb cabin deep in the woods of Oregon. The cabin was nestled far from civilization, surrounded by towering pines and cradled by the whispers of the wind. As we arrived, we were greeted by the serenity of the forest, a stark contrast to the hustle and bustle of city life. The cabin itself was quaint and charming, a rustic refuge we had all been looking forward to. But the tranquility we sought was short-lived. On the second night, we heard the unmistakable noise of a vehicle approaching. We peered out the window to see a dilapidated van pulling into the cabin next door. A family disembarked, looking anything but ordinary. The father was tall and lanky, his face hidden beneath a scruffy beard. The mother, a woman in her 40s, wore a tattered, old-fashioned dress. Their children, a boy and a girl, seemed to lack the energy that children their age should possess. The family was bizarre, to say the least, but we tried to ignore them and enjoy our weekend. As night fell, we heard strange sounds coming from the neighboring cabin. It was as if they were conducting a ritual of some kind. Chants and eerie music echoed through the forest, making our skin crawl. We decided to investigate, making our way through the thick woods toward the cabin next door. Through the gaps in the trees, we caught glimpses of the family dancing around a fire, their eyes wide with an unnatural fervor. It felt like something out of a horror movie. As we retreated to our cabin, I noticed one of the children watching us. Their eyes met mine, and a shiver ran down my spine. The child's expression was one of malevolence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The night passed with an eerie silence. We debated calling the authorities but dismissed the idea, thinking it might just be a quirky family performing some bizarre tradition. We locked the doors and windows and tried to get some sleep. The following morning, we awoke to find our cabin surrounded by strange symbols drawn in the dirt. They were unsettling, resembling something from a dark occult ritual. Panic set in as we realized that our situation was spiraling out of control. Throughout the day, we heard strange noises coming from the neighboring cabin, cries and chants that sent chills down our spines. It was clear that these people were not simply eccentric, they were dangerous. As the day turned into night, we decided it was time to leave. We packed our belongings and quietly made our way to our car. But just as we were about to escape, the family emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity. They blocked our path, and the father, with an eerie smile, said, "You can't leave now. You're part of our ceremony." Panic surged through us as we realized there was no way out. We were trapped, surrounded by these unhinged individuals in the heart of the forest. It was a nightmare that felt all too real, a far cry from the peaceful weekend we had envisioned. Second story, The Disappearing Host by Mark Johnson. I had always been a fan of solo adventures, seeking solitude and peace far from the chaos of everyday life. For my latest escape, I booked an Airbnb cabin in the remote mountains of Colorado. The pictures showed a cozy wooden retreat, isolated from the world. It seemed like the perfect place to disconnect and rejuvenate. Upon arrival, the cabin lived up to its promise of isolation. It was perched on the edge of a pristine lake, surrounded by dense forests and towering peaks. I had no phone signal, and the nearest town was miles away. It was just me and the beauty of nature. The host, a woman named Laura, had been warm and welcoming in her messages. She left a key for me under the doormat, along with a note saying she would stop by the next day to check in and answer any questions. I settled in, excited about the days of solitude ahead. The first evening was peaceful. I lit a fire in the cabin's cozy fireplace, sipped on a glass of wine, and lost myself in a book. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. It was exactly what I had hoped for. The next morning, I woke up to a note from Laura slipped under the door. It read, "Sorry, I had an emergency and had to leave. I'll be back in a few days." I wasn't thrilled about not meeting her, but I had no complaints about the extra solitude. As the days passed, I explored the beautiful wilderness, hiked, and fished by the lake. But something started to feel off. The cabin, once immaculately clean, had become messy and disheveled. Dishes were left unwashed, and there were strange stains on the floor. One night, I heard footsteps outside the cabin, but when I looked, there was no one there. The feeling of being watched started to creep over me. I began to wonder if Laura's emergency was genuine, or if there was something more sinister at play. The isolation, once a source of comfort, now felt oppressive. I had no way to contact anyone, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. It was as if I had stepped into my own personal horror story. On the fourth day, I decided to hike to the nearby town to find some answers. It was a grueling journey through the rugged terrain, but I needed to know what had happened to Laura. When I finally arrived, I was met with puzzled expressions from the townspeople. None of them knew of a woman named Laura in the area. Fear gnawed at me as I realized I might be alone in the mountains with no host and no way to leave. I rushed back to the cabin, and that's when I found a hidden compartment in the floor. Inside, I discovered a series of disturbing journals written by Laura. The entries were erratic, filled with paranoid ramblings and delusions. She mentioned a malevolent presence in the woods, something that watched her every move. The last entry was particularly chilling. It read, "They're coming for me. I can't stay here. I'm leaving and I'm sorry." That night, as I lay in the cabin, I heard whispers in the dark, the same footsteps from before, and the sense of being watched grew more intense. I realized that whatever had driven Laura away was now targeting me. The dread was suffocating as I tried to come to terms with the fact that I might not make it out of that remote cabin alive. Laura's inexplicable disappearance and the unsettling presence in the woods made it a chilling ordeal that haunted my every moment. Third story, The Cabin in the Storm by Emma Mitchell. My friends and I had always loved the thrill of adventure, and our latest escapade took us to a secluded Airbnb cabin in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, not far from Asheville, North Carolina. We were eager to embrace the beauty of nature, but we were in for an experience unlike any other. The cabin was nestled deep within the woods, surrounded by trees that seemed to stretch to the heavens. It was the perfect setting for a weekend of hiking, campfires, and stargazing. The weather was clear when we arrived, and our excitement was palpable. As the first night fell, we gathered around the crackling fire, trading stories and laughter. The cabin's cozy interior offered warmth and comfort, and the isolation from the city was a welcome change. We were in high spirits, blissfully unaware of the terror that awaited us. But nature had other plans for us. As the second day dawned, the weather took a dramatic turn. Dark clouds rolled in, casting a shroud of gloom over the cabin. The once clear sky now rumbled with thunder, and rain began to pour in torrents. The storm was relentless, unleashing a fury of wind and rain upon the cabin. We huddled inside, grateful for the shelter the cabin provided. But as the hours passed, our situation became increasingly dire. The cabin, though charming, was far from impervious to the elements. The wind howled, and the rain seeped through the roof, soaking everything in its path. We attempted to contact the host, but there was no cell signal, and the landline was dead. We were truly cut off from the outside world. As the storm raged on, we realized that we were trapped in a cabin that was slowly succumbing to the elements. The power went out, leaving us in darkness. Water dripped from the ceiling, creating puddles on the creaking wooden floor. The once inviting atmosphere now felt sinister. The tension among us grew as we listened to the storm's fury. But there was something else, something that unnerved us even more. Above the howling wind, we heard an eerie, high-pitched wailing. It was a sound unlike anything we had ever heard, sending shivers down our spines. We tried to reassure ourselves, thinking it was just the wind playing tricks on our ears, but the wailing persisted. It was as if the storm had brought something else with it, something otherworldly. Fear crept through the group as we huddled together, our flashlights casting eerie shadows on the cabin's walls. The storm continued well into the night, and we were left with no choice but to endure it. It felt as though the cabin itself was protesting our presence, as if the very woods were trying to drive us away. Morning finally broke, and the storm began to subside. As we stepped outside, we were met with a scene of devastation. Trees had fallen, and the path to the cabin was blocked by debris. It was a miracle that the cabin had held up as well as it did. We made our way to the nearest town, shaken by the harrowing experience. The locals told us that the storm had been particularly fierce, but they couldn't explain the unearthly wailing we had heard. It was a chilling mystery that would haunt us for years to come. Our weekend escape had turned into a nightmare, not at the hands of people or the supernatural, but at the mercy of nature itself. It was a reminder that even the most beautiful of places can become a source of terror when faced with the raw power of the elements. Fourth story, The Cabin in the Wilderness by Daniel Smith. Our journey to the Airbnb cabin in the Montana wilderness was supposed to be an escape from the hectic pace of city life. The remote location, far from the nearest town of Kalispell, offered the promise of serenity and relaxation. Little did we know that the wilderness held its own brand of danger. The cabin was perched on the edge of a pristine lake, surrounded by towering pines and snow-capped mountains. It was a picture-perfect setting for our getaway. The only neighbor was miles away, and the solitude was both inviting and intimidating. The first few days passed without incident. We enjoyed hiking, fishing, and the breathtaking scenery. The nights were filled with stories by the fire, laughter, and the reassurance that the nearest town was a significant distance away. But as the days went on, we began to notice strange occurrences. Our supplies began to disappear: food, equipment, even a kayak. We assumed it was a result of our forgetfulness or wildlife in the area. One evening, as we gathered around the campfire, we heard something in the woods. The rustling of leaves and snapping of branches was far too deliberate to be a mere animal. Tension gripped the group as we strained our ears, trying to identify the source of the noise. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was a man, disheveled and wild-looking, with a tangled beard and a ragged jacket. He approached us with a vacant stare, muttering incoherently. We tried to communicate with him, asking if he needed help, but his responses were disjointed and nonsensical. It was clear that he was mentally unstable, and fear began to creep over us. The man didn't leave, and the atmosphere around the campfire grew increasingly uncomfortable. His presence was a stark reminder of our isolation. We were cut off from civilization with a stranger who appeared to be a threat to our safety. We decided to pack up and leave, but the man's agitation escalated. He blocked our path, his eyes filled with paranoia and aggression. It became clear that he was not going to let us go without a confrontation. As we stood there, surrounded by wilderness and the unsettling presence of this stranger, we realized that we were in a perilous situation. Panic set in as we contemplated the long, perilous journey to the nearest town with this man standing in our way. But fortune was on our side. A ranger, who had been alerted by our hosts when we failed to check in as expected, arrived on the scene. He was armed and well-trained, and his presence was a welcome relief. The ranger managed to calm the man and detained him for his own safety. We finally made our way back to civilization, shaken and grateful for our escape. Our idyllic cabin getaway had transformed into a brush with danger. It was a stark reminder that isolation, even in the most beautiful of settings, can harbor unexpected threats. The Montana wilderness had taught us that nature could be both breathtaking and perilous, and that sometimes the real horror is closer than you think. Fifth story, The Disappearing Hostess by Jessica Turner. I had always been an independent soul, and the idea of a solo retreat in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee held a special allure. The Airbnb cabin I had rented was tucked away from civilization, surrounded by lush forests and the promise of solitude. My hostess, Claire, had been attentive and welcoming. She had left detailed instructions and made sure I had everything I needed for my stay. The cabin was quaint and cozy, a refuge from the chaos of daily life. The first few days were blissfully peaceful. I hiked, read, and savored the tranquility. The cabin was a sanctuary, and the isolation was a source of comfort. But on the third day, something changed. I noticed a strange absence of messages from Claire. Her daily check-ins had been replaced by silence. I reached out to her, inquiring about a local hiking trail, but received no response. It was unusual, but I brushed it off as her being busy. As the days went on, the silence from Claire grew more unsettling. Her absence weighed on my mind, and I began to wonder if something had happened to her. I decided to visit the local town to see if anyone had information about her. To my surprise, the townspeople were perplexed by my inquiries. None of them recognized the name Claire, and there was no record of her as a local resident or Airbnb host. My sense of unease deepened as I realized that the woman who had welcomed me into her cabin was a complete stranger. Returning to the cabin, I found no sign of Claire. Her personal belongings had vanished, and the cabin seemed eerily pristine, as if she had never been there. Panic set in as I realized that I was completely alone in an isolated cabin, with no host and no way to reach the outside world. My imagination ran wild as I considered various scenarios. Had I been lured into a trap? Was Claire a fake host with sinister intentions? The isolation that had once felt so inviting now seemed like a prison. As night fell, I heard strange sounds in the woods surrounding the cabin. Whispers in the dark, footsteps outside, and the sense of being watched. It was a nightmarish experience, and I was gripped by fear. The following day, I decided to make a desperate attempt to leave. I packed my belongings and headed for the nearest town. But as I drove along the winding mountain roads, I realized that I was hopelessly lost. The familiar landmarks were gone, and the forest seemed to close in around me. Hours turned into days as I navigated the bewildering labyrinth of the Smoky Mountains. The feeling of being trapped in the wilderness, with no host, no way to communicate, and no way out, was a nightmare beyond imagination. Eventually, I stumbled upon a ranger's station, and they were able to guide me back to civilization. The relief I felt was immense, but the mystery of Claire's disappearance haunted me. I never learned the truth about the hostess who had vanished without a trace, leaving me alone in the heart of the Smoky Mountains. The experience had been a chilling reminder that the beauty of nature could hide the darkest secrets, and that sometimes, the most terrifying experiences are the ones we never see coming. Sixth story, The Unwanted Guest by Richard Thompson. The allure of a secluded cabin in the woods of Vermont had always been a dream for our family. We had found the perfect Airbnb rental, nestled far from the nearest town. The cabin was rustic and charming, offering the promise of a peaceful escape from the chaos of daily life. As we arrived, we were greeted by the beauty of the dense forest that surrounded the cabin. The closest neighbors were miles away, and the isolation was exactly what we had been seeking. It was the ideal setting for a family getaway. The first 2 days passed without incident. We hiked, fished, and enjoyed the simple pleasures of the wilderness. But on the third day, as we returned from a hike, we noticed something amiss. The front door of the cabin was slightly ajar. Initially, we thought it might have been a result of the wind, but as we entered the cabin, it became clear that someone had been inside. The furniture was disturbed, and there were signs of a forced entry. Panic set in as we realized that an uninvited guest had violated our solitude. We searched the cabin, but it appeared that the intruder had left without taking anything. It was a puzzling situation, and we debated calling the authorities. However, the nearest police station was hours away, and we were reluctant to cut our vacation short. The night passed with an uneasy tension. We locked the doors and windows, but sleep was elusive. The feeling of being watched lingered, and every creak of the cabin filled us with dread. It was as if the forest itself was warning us of an impending threat. The following day, we heard footsteps outside the cabin. We cautiously peered through the blinds to see a man, disheveled and haggard, standing near the entrance. His eyes were wild, and he mumbled to himself. We confronted the intruder, asking him who he was and what he wanted. His responses were incoherent, and he seemed to be in a state of distress. We decided to offer him help, thinking he might be lost or in trouble. But as we approached, the man's demeanor shifted. He became agitated and aggressive, making it clear that he was not interested in our assistance. Fear overcame us as we realized that we were dealing with an unstable and potentially dangerous individual. With no cell signal and no way to contact the authorities, we were left with a difficult decision. We couldn't stay in the cabin with the intruder present, and we couldn't leave without a confrontation. As we debated our options, the man's behavior became increasingly erratic. He began shouting and making threatening gestures. It was a nightmarish scenario, as we contemplated the terrifying prospect of defending ourselves in the middle of the remote woods. Our only choice was to retreat from the cabin and make our way to the nearest town, hoping to find help. As we left, we heard the man's crazed laughter echoing through the woods, a haunting sound that chilled us to the core. It was a harrowing experience that had shattered our idyllic family vacation. The isolation we had sought had become a source of terror, and the uninvited guest in the woods of Vermont was a reminder that danger could lurk in even the most serene of settings. Seventh story, The Abandoned Cabin by Alan Cooper. Our group of friends had always enjoyed winter getaways, and this year, we decided to book an Airbnb cabin in the heart of the Adirondacks, not far from Lake Placid, New York. The thought of cozying up by the fire with snow falling outside was an irresistible prospect. The cabin, a charming log structure, was nestled deep in the woods, offering the promise of seclusion and tranquility. We arrived, excited for days filled with skiing, hot cocoa, and laughter. But as we settled in, we discovered that the cabin held a sinister secret. The first evening was delightful. We shared stories, played board games, and savored the warmth of the fireplace. The snowstorm outside only added to the charm. It was a perfect winter retreat. But on the second day, as we explored the cabin, we stumbled upon a hidden room in the basement. The room was small, windowless, and filled with an array of disturbing objects. There were antique medical instruments, old photographs, and journals that hinted at a dark past. As we read through the journals, a chilling history began to emerge. The cabin had once been the residence of a doctor in the early 1900s. He had been a recluse who conducted bizarre medical experiments on the local townsfolk. The journals detailed his twisted practices, including surgeries without anesthesia and attempts at reanimating the dead. The more we delved into the cabin's history, the more disturbing it became. It was as if the very walls held the memories of the doctor's atrocities. We were shaken by the revelation and debated whether to leave the cabin or continue our stay. The snowstorm outside had intensified, making travel difficult and dangerous. We decided to stay but couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. The cabin seemed to come alive with eerie sounds in the night, as if the spirits of the doctor's victims were still present. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, doors creaked open, and the temperature inside the cabin dropped to an unnatural cold. The oppressive atmosphere weighed on us, and we began to feel as if we were intruding on a place that should have remained undisturbed. One night, as we gathered around the fireplace, we heard a disembodied voice whispering in the dark. It spoke of suffering, pain, and the desire for release. The voice was chilling and filled us with dread. We had no explanation for the source of these otherworldly sounds. The final night was the most terrifying. The cabin was plunged into darkness, and we were enveloped in a cold, suffocating silence. As we huddled together, a presence made itself known. A spectral figure, gaunt and grotesque, appeared before us. It was the doctor, his eyes empty and hollow. The cabin had become a nightmarish ordeal, as the doctor's vengeful spirit sought to torment us. Desperation drove us to flee the cabin, even in the midst of the blizzard. We stumbled through the snow, hearts pounding, and made our way to the nearest town. The locals were not surprised to hear our story. They knew of the cabin's dark history and its chilling reputation. It was a lesson learned the hard way, that not all Airbnb rentals were what they seemed. The doctor's twisted legacy had turned our winter retreat into a chilling nightmare, and we left with a profound sense of dread. 8th story, The Mysterious Keys by Amanda Stewart. My partner and I had always loved the idea of a romantic getaway, and our Airbnb cabin in the remote Ozark Mountains of Arkansas seemed like the perfect choice. The cabin was nestled in the woods, far from the nearest town, and offered the promise of tranquility and seclusion. The drive to the cabin was a journey through the wilderness, and the sense of isolation was both exciting and a little unnerving. The cabin itself was charming, with a rustic interior and a view of the forest that was nothing short of breathtaking. The first 2 days were idyllic. We explored the woods, enjoyed the hot tub, and basked in the serenity. It was a perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of daily life. But on the 3rd day, our romantic getaway took a chilling turn. As we were preparing dinner, I noticed a set of old keys on the kitchen counter. They were unlike any we had seen in the cabin, and there was no explanation for their presence. We searched the cabin but found no locks or doors that matched the keys. Puzzled, we tried to contact the host to inquire about the keys, but there was no cell signal, and the landline was dead. We were cut off from the outside world with a mystery on our hands. That night, as we lay in bed, we heard strange sounds coming from the woods. It was as if someone was moving through the forest, coming closer to the cabin. The unease grew as the sounds drew nearer, and we realized that someone, or something, was approaching. We locked the cabin's doors and windows, our hearts pounding with fear. The minutes felt like hours as we listened to the footsteps outside. There was an unnatural quality to the sounds, as if they belonged to something not of this world. The presence in the woods intensified our terror. We could hear whispers, faint and unintelligible, but they seemed to be just beyond the walls of the cabin. It was a night of sheer terror, as we contemplated what could be lurking in the darkness. Morning brought no relief. The keys remained an enigma, and the sense of being watched persisted. We decided to leave the cabin and find help, hoping to unravel the mystery. As we stepped outside, we were met with an eerie sight. The keys, which had been on the kitchen counter, now dangled from the doorknob of the cabin. It was as if someone, or something, had been inside while we slept. Panic set in as we realized that our privacy had been violated, and our romantic getaway had turned into a terrifying ordeal. We rushed to our car and made our way to the nearest town, where we found a sense of safety and were able to contact the authorities. The investigation that followed uncovered no answers. The keys had no apparent purpose, and the eerie presence in the woods remained a chilling mystery. Our romantic getaway had transformed into a nightmarish experience, a reminder that isolation could harbor the most disturbing enigmas. Ninth story, The Stranger in the Storm by Emily Parker. As a lover of solo adventures, the idea of a secluded Airbnb cabin in the rugged wilderness of Maine was an irresistible draw. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, far from civilization, and it promised an escape from the chaos of everyday life. The drive to the cabin was a journey through dense forests and winding roads, and the sense of isolation was palpable. The cabin itself was cozy and charming, with a view of the surrounding wilderness that was nothing short of breathtaking. The first 2 days were filled with hiking, photography, and the blissful solitude of nature. It was the escape I had been craving. But on the third day, as a violent storm approached, my peaceful retreat took a terrifying turn. The storm arrived with a fury that shook the cabin. Rain battered the windows, and the wind howled through the trees. I lit a fire in the fireplace and huddled inside, grateful for the shelter the cabin provided. As the storm raged on, I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. There was a frantic knocking on the cabin door. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and there was no phone signal to call for help. The knocking grew more insistent, and I decided to cautiously open the door. There, drenched and shivering, stood a stranger, a man, wild-eyed and disheveled. He begged for refuge from the storm, explaining that he had been caught in the wilderness and was lost. Fear gripped me, but I couldn't turn away someone in such dire circumstances. I let the stranger inside, and he immediately collapsed by the fire, his teeth chattering from the cold. I offered him a blanket and some hot tea. As he warmed up, The man explained that he had been hiking in the area and had become disoriented in the storm. He had lost his supplies and had no way to contact anyone. It was a plausible story, but something about his demeanor set me on edge. The storm raged on outside, and the stranger's presence inside the cabin was a source of unease. He was restless, and his eyes darted around the room as if he were searching for something. I couldn't shake the feeling that his intentions were not what they seemed. As night fell, the stranger's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He began muttering to himself and casting furtive glances in my direction. The unease that had been simmering within me now escalated into full-blown fear. I realized that I was alone in the remote wilderness with a stranger whose motives were unclear. Panic set in as I contemplated the danger I might be in. Desperation drove me to make a decision. I told the stranger that I was going to step outside to check the storm's intensity, and that I would be right back. It was a ruse, a desperate attempt to escape the cabin and find help. As I ventured outside, I was met with the fury of the storm. The wind and rain lashed at me, and visibility was almost non-existent. But I knew I had to get away from the cabin and the stranger inside. I made my way through the wilderness, following the path I had taken earlier in my hike. The storm was relentless, and the fear of what might be happening back at the cabin drove me forward. After hours of struggling through the tempest, I finally reached a ranger station and was able to contact the authorities. They made their way to the cabin, but when they arrived, the stranger was gone. The investigation that followed uncovered no trace of the man, and his true intentions remained a chilling mystery. My solo adventure in the remote wilderness of Maine had become a nightmare, a stark reminder that even in the most serene of settings, danger could lurk where you least expect it. 10th story, The Vanishing Host by John Reynolds. Our group of friends had always enjoyed adventures, and our Airbnb cabin in the remote Catskill Mountains of New York seemed like the perfect opportunity for a memorable getaway. The cabin was tucked away from the nearest town, promising seclusion and the chance to reconnect with nature. The drive to the cabin was an adventure in itself, winding through dense forests and along narrow mountain roads. The sense of isolation was both thrilling and intimidating. The cabin itself was charming, with a cozy interior and a view of the forest that was simply mesmerizing. The first few days were filled with hiking, campfires, and the blissful freedom of being away from the demands of everyday life. It was an escape that had been long overdue, and our spirits were high. But on the third day, as we ventured into town for supplies, our retreat took a terrifying turn. When we returned to the cabin, we found it empty. The door was ajar, and there were no signs of our host, Sarah, who had been warm and welcoming in her messages. Her car was gone, and her personal belongings were nowhere to be found. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. We tried to contact her but received no response. We searched the cabin for clues, but there were no notes, no explanations, just an eerie emptiness that sent shivers down our spines. Panic set in as we realized that we were stranded in the remote wilderness without a host and no way to contact the outside world. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and we had no idea where Sarah had gone or why she had left the cabin. The isolation that had once felt liberating was now a prison of uncertainty. We locked the doors and windows, the atmosphere inside the cabin growing increasingly tense. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of the leaves outside, felt like a harbinger of something sinister. The following day, as we debated our options, we heard strange sounds coming from the surrounding woods. Whispers, murmurs, and eerie laughter that seemed to drift through the trees. It was as if the forest itself had come to life with unsettling voices. As night fell, the atmosphere inside the cabin grew unbearable. The sense of being watched was overwhelming, and we could hear footsteps and shuffling outside. The terror escalated when we realized that our car had been tampered with, its tires slashed. It was a night of pure horror as we contemplated our dire situation. The cabin had transformed from a refuge into a place of dread, and we were left with no choice but to venture into the dark woods to find help. Leaving the cabin was a terrifying decision, but the fear of the unknown inside was too great to bear. We set out with flashlights, making our way through the dense forest in search of the nearest town. It was a grueling journey, and the isolation of the wilderness pressed in on us from all sides. Hours turned into days as we trudged through the woods, a sense of dread propelling us forward. Finally, we reached a road, and a passing motorist stopped to help. We explained our ordeal, and the stranger took us to the nearest town, where we were able to contact the authorities. The investigation that followed uncovered no answers. Sarah's disappearance remained a chilling mystery, and the cabin in the remote Catskill Mountains had become a place of unsolved terror. Our group's adventure had taken an unexpected and sinister turn, a stark reminder that even in the most beautiful of settings, danger could lurk just beyond the threshold. The isolation we had sought had turned our retreat into a nightmarish ordeal, leaving us with a haunting story we would never forget. Thank you for sticking with us through the whole video. Also, I recommend you this video you see on screen, one of the scariest on my channel. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and like this video. This helps me bring you more thrilling content every day. If this video sent shivers down your spine, let me know in the comments.